The following is a list of terms and definitions as well as examples that can be used for the study of constitutional law. Fruit of the poisonous tree. Definition: this doctrine in U.S. law states that evidence obtained illegally cannot be used in court, as it is tainted by the illegal method used to acquire it. Example: if a police officer conducts an illegal search of a suspect's home without a warrant and finds incriminating documents, these documents cannot be used as evidence in court. Furthermore, if these documents lead the police to other evidence, that evidence is also inadmissible because it is derived from the initial illegal search. Open fields doctrine. Definition: a legal principle allowing law enforcement to enter and search open fields without a warrant. Example: a police officer, while chasing a suspect, enters a large, unfenced, and open field owned by someone else and discovers illegal substances in plain view. The substances can be legally seized and used as evidence, as the open fields doctrine does not require a warrant for such areas, which are outside the curtilage of a home. Stop and frisk. Definition: a police practice where an individual is stopped and searched for weapons or contraband without a warrant. Example: a police officer observes a person acting suspiciously in a high crime area and frisks them, suspecting they may be carrying a weapon. This practice, known as stop and frisk, is permissible if the officer has reasonable suspicion that the person is armed and presently dangerous. 13th Amendment. Definition: an amendment to the U.S. Constitution that abolished slavery and involuntary servitude. Example: the 13th Amendment, ratified in 1865, legally ended the practice of slavery in the United States. It was a significant step in American history, ensuring that no individual within the United States or any place subject to its jurisdiction would be held in involuntary servitude or slavery. 42U Escape. Section 1983. Definition: a federal statute allowing individuals to sue for civil rights violations by government officials. Example: a person who is wrongfully beaten by a police officer during an arrest can file a lawsuit under 42U Escape. Section 1983, claiming a violation of their civil rights, specifically their right to be free from excessive force under the Fourth Amendment. Affirmative action. Definition: policies that support members of disadvantaged groups through education and employment. Example: a university implements an affirmative action policy in its admissions process, considering race as one of several factors to promote diversity and address historical racial imbalances in education. Arrest warrant. Definition: a legal document issued by a judge authorizing the arrest of a specific individual. Example: after gathering sufficient evidence, the police present their findings to a judge, who issues an arrest warrant for a suspect in a robbery case. This warrant legally permits the police to arrest the suspect at their place of residence. Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution. Definition: this article establishes the executive branch of the U.S. government. Example: Article 2 of the Constitution outlines the powers and duties of the President, including being the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces and having the authority to sign or veto legislation. Article 3 of the U.S. Constitution. Definition: this article establishes the judicial branch of the U.S. government. Example: Article 3 creates the Supreme Court and allows Congress to establish lower federal courts, outlining the judicial power of the United States and the tenure of federal judges. Beyond a reasonable doubt. Definition: the standard of proof required to convict in a criminal trial. Example: in a criminal trial, the prosecution must prove the defendant's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, meaning the evidence presented must leave the jurors firmly convinced of the defendant's guilt. Bill of Rights. Definition: the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution, guaranteeing specific freedoms and rights. Example: the Bill of Rights includes fundamental liberties such as freedom of speech, religion, and the press, and protections like the right to a fair trial and the prohibition of unreasonable searches and seizures. Bills of Attainder. Definition: laws that punish individuals without a judicial trial. Example: the U.S. Constitution prohibits the use of bills of attainder, ensuring that individuals cannot be legislatively declared guilty of a crime and punished without a trial. Border search. Definition: searches conducted at national borders or airports, often without a warrant. Example: customs officers at an international airport search the luggage of travelers entering the country, looking for contraband like drugs or illegal goods, without needing individual warrants for each search. Brady violation. Definition: when the prosecution fails to disclose evidence favorable to the defendant. Example: in a criminal trial, if the prosecution discovers a witness who could corroborate the defendant's alibi but fails to inform the defense about this witness, it constitutes a Brady violation. Brown v. Board of Education. Definition: a landmark Supreme Court case that declared racial segregation in public schools unconstitutional. Example: the 1954 decision in Brown v. Board of Education overturned the separate but equal doctrine, leading to the desegregation of schools across the United States and becoming a cornerstone in the civil rights movement. Civil asset forfeiture. Definition: the legal process where law enforcement seizes assets suspected of being connected to crime. Example: law enforcement seizes a luxury car from a drug dealer, suspecting it was purchased with proceeds from illegal drug sales. This seizure, even without a criminal conviction, is an example of civil asset forfeiture. Civil liberties. Definition: basic rights and freedoms guaranteed to individuals, typically protected from government infringement. Example: civil liberties include the right to free speech, which allows individuals to express their opinions without fear of government censorship or retaliation. Civil Rights Acts. Definition: laws enacted to protect and ensure the civil rights of individuals. Example: the Civil Rights Act of 1964, a landmark piece of legislation, prohibited discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin in employment practices and public accommodations. Comity. Definition: legal principle where jurisdictions recognize and respect the laws and judicial decisions of others. Example: a court in one state may recognize and enforce a child custody ruling made by a court in another state, based on the principle of comity. Compulsory process clause. Definition: a constitutional clause allowing defendants to obtain witnesses in their favor. Example: in a criminal trial, a defendant uses the compulsory process clause to subpoena witnesses who can provide testimony that supports their defense. Consent. Definition: voluntary agreement to a proposal or action without coercion. Example: a homeowner voluntarily agrees to let police officers search their home without a warrant, providing clear and uncoerced consent. Consent search. Definition: a search conducted by law enforcement with the consent of the individual. Example: during a traffic stop, a driver agrees to let the police officer search their vehicle. This consent allows the officer to conduct the search without a warrant. Constitution. Definition: the supreme law of the United States, outlining the national frame of government. Example: the U.S. Constitution establishes the structure of the federal government, including the legislative, executive, and judicial branches, and enumerates the rights and freedoms of the citizens. Constitutional law. Definition: the body of law dealing with the interpretation and implementation of the Constitution. Example: a court case challenging the constitutionality of. A law restricting freedom of speech would be an example of constitutional law in action. Court of Appeals. Definition: intermediate federal courts that review decisions of lower courts. Example: a party dissatisfied with a decision made by a federal district court can appeal to the Court of Appeals for the circuit in which the district court is located. Cruel and unusual punishment. Definition: punishment prohibited by the Eighth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Example: the Supreme Court ruling that sentencing a juvenile to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for a non-homicidal crime is cruel and unusual punishment. Custodial interrogation. Definition: questioning by law enforcement of a suspect in custody. Example: after being arrested and taken to a police station, a suspect is questioned by detectives about their involvement in a crime. This scenario is considered custodial interrogation, and the suspect must be read their Miranda rights. De facto segregation. Definition: segregation resulting from social, economic, or other factors, not by law. Example: despite legal desegregation, a school may experience de facto segregation if its student body is predominantly of one race due to the racial makeup of the neighborhood. Declaration of Independence. Definition: the document declaring the 13 American colonies' independence from Britain. Example: the Declaration of Independence, adopted on July 4, 1776, articulated the colonies' reasons for seeking independence, including grievances against British rule and a statement of fundamental human rights. Double jeopardy. Definition: the Fifth Amendment principle that prevents a person from being tried twice for the same crime. Example: after being acquitted of burglary charges, a defendant cannot be retried for the same offense, even if new evidence emerges, due to the protection against double jeopardy. Due process. Definition: legal principle ensuring fair treatment through the normal judicial system. Example: a person facing criminal charges has the right to a fair and public trial, legal representation, and the opportunity to confront witnesses against them, as part of their due process rights. Continuing with the next set of terms. Due process clause. Definition: a clause in the Constitution ensuring fair treatment through the judicial system. Example: the Due Process Clause in both the Fifth and 14th Amendments protects individuals from being deprived of life, liberty, or property without adequate legal procedures and safeguards. Eighth Amendment. Definition: an amendment to the U.S. Constitution prohibiting cruel and unusual punishment. Example: the Eighth Amendment has been interpreted by the Supreme Court to mean that excessively harsh penalties, such as a life sentence for a minor theft, are unconstitutional. Eminent domain. Definition: the power of the government to take private property for public use, with compensation. Example: a city uses eminent domain to acquire private land to build a new public park, ensuring that the landowners are fairly compensated for their property. Equal protection of the law. Definition: a constitutional guarantee that similar individuals will be treated equally by the law. Example: the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment has been used to challenge and overturn laws that discriminated against people based on race, such as segregation laws. Establishment of religion. Definition: the First Amendment clause preventing the government from establishing a national religion. Example: the Establishment Clause prohibits public schools from mandating religious practices, such as school-led prayer, ensuring the separation of church and state. Ex post facto laws. Definition: laws that make an action illegal retroactively. Example: a state cannot pass a law that criminalizes an action after it has been committed. For instance, if a state passes a law in 2023 making a specific act illegal, it cannot prosecute individuals who committed that act in 2022. Exclusionary rule. Definition: a rule that excludes evidence obtained in violation of a defendant's constitutional rights. Example: if police conduct a search without a warrant or probable cause and find incriminating evidence, that evidence may be excluded from trial under the exclusionary rule. Executive powers. Definition: powers held by the President of the United States under Article 2 of the Constitution. Example: the President's executive powers include the authority to sign bills into law, appoint federal judges, and conduct foreign policy. Executive privilege. Definition: the President's right to withhold information from Congress or the judiciary. Example: a president might invoke executive privilege to refuse to disclose confidential communications between them and their advisors regarding national security matters. Exigent circumstances. Definition: situations that allow law enforcement to enter a property without a warrant due to an emergency. Example: police may enter a home without a warrant if they hear sounds of a person in distress inside and believe that immediate action is necessary to prevent harm. Expectation of privacy. Definition: the legal principle that one's personal information is protected from public scrutiny. Example: an individual has a reasonable expectation of privacy in their own home, meaning that law enforcement cannot conduct a search without a warrant or consent. Federal preemption. Definition: the principle that federal law overrides conflicting state laws. Example: if a federal environmental law sets certain emissions standards, a state cannot enforce a law with less stringent standards due to the doctrine of federal preemption. Federalism. Definition: the system of government in which power is divided between a central authority and constituent units. Example: in the United States, the federal government has certain powers, such as regulating interstate commerce, while states retain powers like conducting elections and establishing local governments. Feminist jurisprudence. Definition: a legal theory examining the law's impact on women and advocating for gender equality. Example: feminist jurisprudence critiques laws and legal practices that perpetuate gender inequalities, such as those affecting reproductive rights or workplace discrimination. 15th Amendment. Definition: an amendment to the U.S. Constitution granting voting rights regardless of race, color, or previous servitude. Example: the 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, was a significant step in ensuring African American men the right to vote, although it took many more years and additional laws to fully realize this right. Fifth Amendment. Definition: an amendment protecting individuals from self-incrimination and double jeopardy. Example: during a criminal trial, a defendant can invoke the Fifth Amendment to refuse to testify, thereby avoiding self-incrimination. First Amendment. Definition: an amendment protecting freedoms of speech, religion, press, assembly, and petition. Example: the First Amendment allows individuals to protest government actions, speak freely on various topics, and practice their chosen religion without government interference. Foreign intelligence exception. Definition: an exception to the Fourth Amendment allowing warrantless surveillance for national security. Example: the government may conduct surveillance without a warrant on a foreign spy operating within the United States under the Foreign Intelligence Exception. 14th Amendment. Definition: an amendment providing citizenship rights and equal protection under the law. Example: the 14th Amendment has been instrumental in civil rights litigation, including cases that have expanded the rights of minorities and other marginalized groups. Freedom of contract. Definition: the right to enter into lawful agreements without undue government interference. Example: two parties freely entering into a business contract without excessive restrictions or regulations imposed by the government. Freedom of religion. Definition: the First Amendment right allowing individuals to practice any religion or none at all. Example: an individual choosing to practice Buddhism in a predominantly Christian community is protected under the Freedom of Religion Clause. Full faith and credit. Definition: a constitutional clause requiring states to recognize the public acts, records, and judicial proceedings of other states. Example: a marriage legally performed in one state must be recognized as valid in all other states under the Full Faith and Credit Clause. Fundamental rights. Definition: basic rights inherent to human dignity, often protected under constitutional law. Example: the right to marry, the right to vote, and the right to privacy are considered fundamental rights and are given heightened protection under the Constitution. Gender discrimination. Definition: unfair treatment based on a person's gender. Example: a woman being denied a promotion solely because of her gender is an instance of gender discrimination, which is prohibited under various laws, including the Civil Rights Act. Gideon v. Wainwright. Definition: a landmark Supreme Court case guaranteeing the right to an attorney in criminal cases. Example: in Gideon v. Wainwright, 1963, the Supreme Court ruled that states are required to provide legal counsel to defendants who cannot afford an attorney, ensuring fair trials for all. Grand jury indictment. Definition: a formal charge issued by a grand jury allowing a criminal case to proceed. Example: before a high-profile criminal case goes to trial, a grand jury may be convened to review evidence and determine whether there is sufficient cause to indict the accused. Harmless error analysis. Definition: a legal principle stating that not all trial errors require a conviction to be overturned. Example: if a judge makes a minor procedural mistake during a trial, but the overall evidence strongly supports the verdict, an appellate court may deem it a harmless error and uphold the conviction. Hostile work environment. Definition: a form of workplace harassment where an individual's work environment is made intimidating or offensive. Example: consistent and unwelcome sexual comments or jokes in the workplace that create a hostile and uncomfortable environment for an employee can be grounds for a harassment claim. Impartial jury. Definition: a jury that is unbiased and without prejudice regarding the case or parties involved. Example: during jury selection for a criminal trial, potential jurors who have preconceived opinions about the case or the defendant are typically excluded to ensure an impartial jury. Impeachment. Definition: the process by which a legislative body formally levels charges against a high official of government. Example: the U.S. House of Representatives can impeach a sitting president if there is evidence of high crimes and misdemeanors, with the Senate then conducting a trial to determine whether to remove the president from office. Inherent powers. Definition: powers not explicitly specified in the Constitution but necessary for the government to function effectively. Example: the president's power to recognize foreign governments is an inherent power, as it is not expressly stated in the Constitution but is essential for conducting foreign affairs. Involuntary confession. Definition: a confession obtained through coercion, duress, or without proper legal safeguards. Example: a confession made by a suspect after being subjected to prolonged interrogation without access to an attorney or being informed of their rights may be deemed involuntary and inadmissible in court. Judicial bias. Definition: prejudice or predisposition by a judge towards one side in a legal case. Example: if a judge has a personal relationship with a party in a lawsuit or has publicly expressed opinions about the case, it may raise concerns of judicial bias and warrant their recusal. Judicial power. Definition: the authority vested in courts to interpret and apply the law. Example: the judicial power of the United States allows the Supreme Court to declare laws unconstitutional, effectively shaping the interpretation and application of the law. Judicial review. Definition: the power of courts to assess whether a law or governmental action is constitutional. Example: in the landmark case Marbury v. Madison, the Supreme Court established the principle of judicial review, enabling it to invalidate laws that conflict with the Constitution. Jurisdiction. Definition: the legal authority of a court to hear and decide a case. Example: a federal court has jurisdiction over cases involving federal law, while a state court has jurisdiction over matters under state law. Just compensation. Definition: fair market value paid by the government when private property is taken for public use. Example: when the government uses eminent domain to acquire land for a highway, the property owner must receive just compensation, typically the market value of the property. Justiciable controversy. Definition: a dispute appropriate for resolution in court, involving a real and substantial conflict. Example: a lawsuit challenging the constitutionality of a newly enacted law presents a justiciable controversy, as it involves a specific legal question and affects the parties' rights. Knock and announce rule. Definition: a legal requirement for police to announce their presence and purpose before entering a residence. Example: before executing a search warrant, police officers must knock on the door and announce their identity and intent, unless circumstances justify a no-knock entry. Lawful arrest. Definition: an arrest made under the authority of law, typically with a warrant or based on probable cause. Example: police officers arrest a suspect after witnessing them commit a crime, constituting a lawful arrest based on probable cause. Lawrence v. Texas. Definition: a Supreme Court case that struck down laws criminalizing consensual homosexual activity. Example: in Lawrence v. Texas, 2003, the Supreme Court ruled that state laws banning private, consensual sexual conduct between adults of the same sex were unconstitutional. Legislative powers. Definition: the authority to make laws, vested in the legislative branch of government. Example: the U.S. Congress, composed of the House of Representatives and the Senate, exercises legislative powers by drafting, debating, and passing federal laws. Liberty. Definition: the state of being free within society from oppressive restrictions imposed by authority. Example: the concept of liberty encompasses various freedoms, such as the freedom of speech and the right to privacy, protected under the Constitution. Liberty interest. Definition: a person's interest in having freedom from arbitrary or unjustified government interference. Example: a person's liberty interest might be violated if they are detained by the government without due process of law. Mere suspicion. Definition: a level of belief less than probable cause, not sufficient for legal action. Example: if a police officer has mere suspicion that someone might be involved in illegal activity but lacks concrete evidence, they cannot legally detain or search the person. Miranda rights. Definition: rights read to a person in custody before interrogation, informing them of their right to remain silent and to an attorney. Example: when arresting a suspect, police officers must recite the Miranda warning, ensuring the suspect is aware of their rights, including the right to remain silent and the right to legal counsel. Mootness. Definition: a criterion used to dismiss cases that no longer require resolution. Example: if the issues in a lawsuit are resolved outside of court before the case is heard, the case may be dismissed as moot. Motion to suppress. Definition: a request by a defendant to exclude certain evidence from trial, usually on the grounds that it was obtained illegally. Example: a defense attorney files a motion to suppress evidence found during an illegal search, arguing that it violates the Fourth Amendment. Motor vehicle searches. Definition: searches conducted by law enforcement on vehicles, often with less stringent requirements than for homes. Example: police officers may search a vehicle if they have probable cause to believe it contains evidence of a crime, such as drugs or illegal weapons. Necessary and proper clause. Definition: a clause in the Constitution granting Congress the power to pass all laws necessary and proper for carrying out its enumerated powers. Example: the necessary and proper clause allows Congress to establish a national bank, even though the power to do so is not explicitly listed in the Constitution. 19th Amendment. Definition: an amendment to the U.S. Constitution granting women the right to vote. Example: ratified in 1920, the 19th Amendment was a significant milestone in the women's suffrage movement, ensuring that the right to vote could not be denied based on sex. Oath or affirmation. Definition: a formal declaration of truth or commitment, often required in legal proceedings. Example: witnesses in a court trial take an oath or affirmation to tell the truth before giving their testimony. Overbreadth doctrine. Definition: a principle used to invalidate laws that are too broad and infringe on protected freedoms. Example: a law that broadly bans all forms of public demonstration might be struck down under the overbreadth doctrine for infringing on the First Amendment right to free speech. Plain view. Definition: a legal doctrine allowing law enforcement to seize evidence without a warrant if it is clearly visible. Example, if a police officer lawfully enters a home and sees illegal drugs in plain view on a table, they can seize the drugs without a warrant. Planned Parenthood v. Casey. Definition: a Supreme Court case that reaffirmed the constitutional right to have an abortion while allowing states to impose certain restrictions. Example, in Planned Parenthood v. Casey, 1992, the court upheld the core holding of Roe v. Wade but also allowed states to implement laws that did not place an undue burden on a woman's right to choose an abortion. Police power. Definition: the authority conferred upon the states to regulate behavior and enforce order within their territory for the betterment of health, safety, morals, and general welfare. Example, a state exercises its police power by enacting environmental regulations to protect the health and welfare of its residents. Preamble to the Constitution. Definition: the introductory statement to the U.S. Constitution, setting forth the general principles of American governance. Example, the preamble, beginning with "We the people," outlines the Constitution's purposes, such as establishing justice, ensuring domestic tranquility, and securing the blessings of liberty. Presumption of innocence. Definition: the principle that a person is considered innocent until proven guilty. Example, in a criminal trial, the defendant is treated as innocent, and the burden is on the prosecution to prove their guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Prior restraint of speech. Definition: government action that prohibits speech or other expression before it can take place. Example, a court order barring a newspaper from publishing a story about a corporate scandal is an example of prior restraint and is generally considered a violation of the First Amendment. Privilege, law of defamation. Definition: a defense in defamation cases where the defendant's statements are protected under law. Example, statements made by legislators during official proceedings are typically privileged and cannot form the basis of a defamation lawsuit. Privileged communications. Definition: conversations that are protected from disclosure in legal proceedings. Example, communications between an attorney and their client are considered privileged and cannot be disclosed in court without the client's consent. Privileges and Immunities Clause. Definition: a constitutional clause preventing states from discriminating against citizens of other states. Example, a state cannot charge out-of-state residents higher tuition fees for state universities than it charges its own residents, as this would violate the Privileges and Immunities Clause. Probable cause. Definition: a reasonable basis for believing that a crime may have been committed. Example, if police have evidence linking a person to a burglary, such as fingerprints or eyewitness testimony, they have probable cause to arrest that person. Procedural due process. Definition: the requirement that legal proceedings be conducted fairly and in accordance with established rules and principles. Example, procedural due process ensures that a person facing trial is given notice of the charges against them and an opportunity to be heard in court. Proportionality and punishment. Definition: the principle that the severity of punishment should match the severity of the crime. Example, sentencing a person to life imprisonment for a minor theft would be disproportionate and could violate the Eighth Amendment's ban on cruel and unusual punishment. Protected class. Definition: groups of people legally protected from discrimination. Example, the Civil Rights Act protects individuals from discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, making these groups protected classes. Punishment. Definition: a penalty imposed for wrongdoing. Example, a court sentences a convicted criminal to a term of imprisonment as punishment for their crime. Pursuit of happiness. Definition: a fundamental right implied by the Declaration of Independence, suggesting that individuals have the right to seek personal fulfillment. Example, the pursuit of happiness could include the freedom to choose one's career, lifestyle, and personal relationships without undue government interference. Rational basis test. Definition: a standard of review used by courts to evaluate laws that affect constitutional rights. Example, a law requiring motorcyclists to wear helmets might be upheld under the rational basis test if the government can show that the law is reasonably related to public safety. Reasonable notice. Definition: the legal requirement to inform individuals of legal actions or decisions that affect their rights or duties. Example, a tenant must be given reasonable notice before being evicted, ensuring they have time to find alternative housing or challenge the eviction. Reasonable suspicion. Definition: a standard used in criminal procedure, less than probable cause, but more than a mere hunch, that justifies brief stops and detentions, but not full searches. Example, police may stop a pedestrian if they have reasonable suspicion, based on specific and articulable facts, that the person is involved in criminal activity. Retaliatory hostile work environment. Definition: a form of workplace harassment where an employee is subjected to a hostile environment as retaliation for engaging in legally protected activity. Example: an employee who files a discrimination complaint and is subsequently subjected to increased scrutiny, derogatory comments, and exclusion by supervisors may be experiencing a retaliatory hostile work environment. Right against self-incrimination. Definition: the constitutional right of a person to refuse to answer questions or provide information that could incriminate them. Example: during a police interrogation, a suspect can invoke their Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination and refuse to answer questions that might lead to self-incrimination. Right of privacy. Definition: the right to be free from unwarranted government intrusion into personal and private affairs. Example: the right of privacy includes the right to make personal decisions regarding marriage, procreation, contraception, family relationships, child rearing, and education. Right to a speedy trial. Definition: the constitutional right of a criminal defendant to have a prompt trial. Example: a defendant in a criminal case can invoke their Sixth Amendment right to a speedy trial to prevent undue and lengthy delays before their case is heard. Right to bail. Definition: the right of an accused person to be released from custody upon providing security, bail, set by a court, ensuring their return for trial. Example: after being charged with a nonviolent crime, a defendant may be granted the right to post bail, allowing them to remain out of jail while awaiting trial. Right to bear arms. Definition: the Second Amendment right allowing individuals to own and carry firearms. Example: the right to bear arms permits citizens to own guns for purposes such as self-defense, hunting, and sporting activities, subject to certain regulations. Right to confrontation. Definition: the constitutional right of a criminal defendant to confront witnesses against them. Example: in a trial, the defendant has the right to cross-examine prosecution witnesses, challenging their testimony and credibility. Right to counsel. Definition: the constitutional right of a criminal defendant to have the assistance of a lawyer. Example: if a defendant cannot afford an attorney, the court must appoint one to represent them, ensuring their right to counsel is upheld. Right to due process of law. Definition: the right to fair treatment through the normal judicial system, especially as a citizen's entitlement. Example: due process of law includes the right to be heard in a fair and impartial court, to be informed of charges against you, and to have a fair opportunity to present your case. Right to jury trial. Definition: the constitutional right to have a legal case decided by a jury of one's peers. Example: in criminal cases, defendants often have the right to a jury trial, where a group of citizens listens to the evidence and determines guilt or innocence. Right to privacy. Definition: the right to a private personal life free from the intrusion of government. Example: the right to privacy encompasses various aspects of personal autonomy, including the right to use contraception and the right to an abortion, as recognized in cases like Griswold v. Connecticut and Roe v. Wade. Roe v. Wade. Definition: the landmark Supreme Court decision that established a woman's legal right to an abortion. Example: Roe v. Wade, 1973, held that laws criminalizing or restricting access to abortions violated a woman's right to privacy under the 14th Amendment. Search incident to arrest. Definition: a legal principle that allows police to perform a warrantless search of an arrested person in the area within their immediate control. Example: after lawfully arresting a suspect for a drug offense, police can search the suspect and the immediate area around them for weapons or evidence. Search warrant. Definition: a legal document authorizing a police officer or other official to enter and search premises. Example: police obtain a search warrant from a judge to search a suspect's home for evidence related to a burglary investigation. Second Amendment. Definition: the constitutional amendment that protects the right of the people to keep and bear arms. Example: the Second Amendment is often cited in debates over gun control laws, with different interpretations regarding the extent of the right to own firearms. Separation of powers. Definition: the division of government responsibilities into distinct branches to limit any one branch from exercising the core functions of another. Example: the U.S. government is divided into three branches: legislative, makes laws; executive, enforces laws; and judicial, interprets laws, exemplifying the principle of separation of powers. Sex discrimination. Definition: unfair treatment or consideration based on an individual's sex. Example: Denying a qualified individual a job because of their gender is an example of sex discrimination, which is illegal under federal law. Sexual harassment. Definition: unwelcome sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, and other verbal or physical harassment of a sexual nature. Example: persistent unwelcome sexual comments or advances by a supervisor towards an employee can constitute sexual harassment, creating a hostile work environment. 16th Amendment. Definition: the constitutional amendment that allows the federal government to levy an income tax. Example: the 16th Amendment, ratified in 1913, provides the legal basis for the federal government to collect income taxes from individuals and corporations. 6th Amendment. Definition: the constitutional amendment that provides rights to criminal defendants, such as the right to a speedy and public trial, an impartial jury, and the right to counsel. Example: the Sixth Amendment ensures that a person accused of a crime has the right to confront the witnesses against them and to have a lawyer for their defense. Spending power. Definition: the constitutional power of Congress to spend money to provide for the general welfare. Example: Congress uses its spending power to fund various federal programs, such as Social Security, Medicare, and national defense. Standing. Definition: the legal right to bring a lawsuit, based on the party's stake in the outcome. Example: a person who is directly affected by a government action has standing to challenge it in court, whereas someone without a direct, personal stake typically does not. State action or under color of law. Definition: actions taken by government officials or entities, or private individuals performing public functions or acting with significant state involvement. Example: a police officer making an arrest is acting under color of law, as are private security guards contracted by a city to perform public safety duties. Strict scrutiny test. Definition: a form of judicial review that courts use to determine the constitutionality of certain laws, requiring the government to prove that the law is necessary to achieve a compelling state interest and is narrowly tailored to achieve that interest. Example: laws that discriminate based on race or infringe upon fundamental rights, like voting, are subject to strict scrutiny and must meet a high standard of justification. Substantive due process. Definition: a principle allowing courts to protect certain fundamental rights from government interference, even if procedural protections are present. Example: substantive due process has been used to protect rights not explicitly mentioned in the Constitution, such as the right to privacy and decisions about family and personal relationships. Supremacy Clause. Definition: a clause in the U.S. Constitution stating that federal law is the supreme law of the land, overriding any state laws that conflict with it. Example: if a state law conflicts with a federal law, the federal law prevails under the Supremacy Clause, ensuring a uniform national legal framework. 10th Amendment. Definition: the constitutional amendment stating that powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people. Example: the 10th Amendment is often cited in arguments supporting states' rights and powers, such as the authority to regulate education and local law enforcement. Terry v. Ohio. Definition: a landmark Supreme Court case that established the legality of stop and frisk practices by police under certain circumstances. Example: in Terry v. Ohio, 1968, the court held that police can stop and briefly detain a person if they have reasonable suspicion that the person is involved in criminal activity and can frisk them for weapons if they believe the person is armed and dangerous. The Commerce Clause. Definition: a clause in the U.S. Constitution giving Congress the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations, among the several states, and with Indian tribes. Example: the Commerce Clause has been used to justify federal laws regulating activities that have a substantial effect on interstate commerce, such as environmental regulations and civil rights laws. The Compact Clause. Definition: a clause in the U.S. Constitution that prohibits states from entering into any agreement or compact with another state or a foreign power without the consent of Congress. Example: the Compact Clause ensures that states cannot independently make treaties or alliances that could undermine the unity or foreign policy of the United States. The right of free speech. Definition: the First Amendment right allowing individuals to express themselves without government restraint. Example: the right of free speech includes the freedom to voice opinions, protest government actions, and publish writings, subject to certain limitations like laws against incitement or defamation. The Takings Clause. Definition: a clause in the Fifth Amendment stating that private property cannot be taken for public use without just compensation. Example: if the government needs to acquire private land to build a highway, it must compensate the property owner fairly, as required by the Takings Clause. The taxing power. Definition: the constitutional power granted to Congress to impose taxes, duties, imposts, and excises. Example: the federal government's ability to levy income taxes is an exercise of its taxing power, providing revenue to fund government operations and services. The war power. Definition: the constitutional powers of the federal government to wage war, which are divided between Congress and the President. Example: while the President is the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, only Congress has the power to declare war, reflecting a balance of war powers between the branches. Three sources of law. Definition: the three main sources of law in the United States are the Constitution, statutes, laws passed by legislatures, and case law, judicial decisions. Example: the U.S. legal system is based on the Constitution as the supreme law, statutes enacted by Congress and state legislatures, and legal precedents established by court decisions. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. Definition: a federal law prohibiting employment discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. Example: Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 allows employees to file lawsuits against employers who discriminate in hiring, promotion, or other aspects of employment. Treason. Definition: the crime of betraying one's country, defined in the U.S. Constitution as levying war against the United States or giving aid and comfort to its enemies. Example: an individual who provides military secrets to a foreign government engaged in hostilities with the United States could be charged with treason. Trial by jury. Definition: the right to have a legal case decided by a jury of one's peers. Example: in a criminal case, the defendant can exercise their right to trial by jury, where a group of citizens listens to the evidence and determines guilt or innocence. 12th Amendment. Definition: an amendment to the U.S. Constitution that provides the procedure for electing the President and Vice President. Example: the 12th Amendment, ratified in 1804, requires electors in the Electoral College to cast separate ballots for President and Vice President. 25th Amendment. Definition: an amendment to the U.S. Constitution that addresses presidential succession and disability. Example: the 25th Amendment provides procedures for replacing the President or Vice President in the event of death, removal, resignation, or incapacitation. 24th Amendment. Definition: an amendment to the U.S. Constitution prohibiting poll taxes in federal elections. Example: the 24th Amendment, ratified in 1964, helped dismantle barriers to voting for low-income and minority citizens by eliminating the poll tax requirement. Unconstitutional. Definition: not in accordance with a political constitution, especially the U.S. Constitution, or with procedural rules. Example: a law that infringes on the freedom of speech or denies due process rights can be declared unconstitutional by a court. Undue influence. Definition: excessive pressure or influence exerted on someone, impairing their free will and leading to an unfair agreement or contract. Example: a contract may be voided if one party can prove that it was signed under undue influence, where they were coerced or manipulated into agreeing. Unreasonable search and seizure. Definition: a search or seizure by law enforcement without a warrant and without probable cause to believe that a crime has been committed, considered a violation of the Fourth Amendment. Example: a police officer entering and searching a home without a warrant or exigent circumstances would typically constitute an unreasonable search and seizure. Vagueness doctrine. Definition: a legal principle that invalidates laws that are too vague to be understood and enforced fairly. Example: a law that prohibits annoying behavior without further definition might be struck down under the vagueness doctrine for being too indefinite. Verdict. Definition: a decision on a disputed issue in a civil or criminal case or an inquest. Example: in a criminal trial, the jury delivers a verdict of guilty or not guilty based on the evidence presented. Vicarious liability. Definition: legal responsibility assigned to one person for the actions of another, typically in employer-employee relationships. Example: a company may be held vicariously liable for damages caused by the negligent actions of its employees while they are performing their job duties. Voting Rights Act of 1965. Definition: a landmark piece of federal legislation in the United States that prohibits racial discrimination in voting. Example: the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was instrumental in overcoming legal barriers at the state and local levels that prevented African Americans from exercising their right to vote. Warrant. Definition: a document issued by a legal or government official authorizing the police or another body to make an arrest, search premises, or carry out some other action relating to the administration of justice. Example: before conducting a search of a suspect's home, police must obtain a search warrant from a judge, based on probable cause. Writ of certiorari. Definition: an order by a higher court directing a lower court to send the record in a given case for review. Example: the U.S. Supreme Court issues a writ of certiorari to review the decision of a lower court, selecting cases that have national significance or legal importance. Writ of habeas corpus. Definition: a court order to a person or agency holding someone in custody to deliver the imprisoned individual to the court issuing the order. Example: a prisoner can file a writ of habeas corpus claiming that their imprisonment is unlawful and requesting the court to determine the legality of their detention. Zoning. Definition: the legislative process for dividing land into zones for different uses, such as residential, commercial, and industrial, to regulate land use and development. Example: a city's zoning laws may designate certain areas for residential use, prohibiting the operation of businesses or factories in those areas to maintain the character of the neighborhood. Thanks for listening. We hope this helps you with your studying so you can be prepared to get your best possible score.